The kettle begins long before the story does. You can hear it in the smallest sounds. The soft clink of a lid, the faint sigh of metal warming, the gentle tick-tick of cooling air shifting inside a spout. In the dark, when the day has finally loosened its grip, that little ritual feels almost ancient. Water is patient. It is willing to wait for you. And when it starts to steam, it offers you a door, one that opens not into a room, but into time. So let's step through quietly. Imagine a hillside where clouds move low enough to brush the leaves. The air is clean and damp, and the green is not a bright, noisy green, but a deep, steady one, as if the plants have learned to keep their color to themselves. This is the kind of place tea likes. Slopes and mist, soils that drain well, mornings that begin cool and end gently warm. The tea plant, Camellia sinensis, can live like a small tree if you let it, but humans almost never do. We prune it down again and again to a convenient height, because the tender, newest leaves are the ones we want, and because hands get tired reaching too high. If you run your fingers along a young leaf, it has that slight firmness, a waxy resilience. It does not feel fragile. Yet tea's whole history is built on fragility. The fragility of aroma, of harvest timing, of weather, of trade routes, of empires that wanted comfort without paying the full price. Tea begins, as many beloved things do, with a story that may not be literally true, but is true in the way people use stories to remember what matters. In the oldest and most famous Chinese legend, an ancient ruler and healer named Shen Nong is boiling water, because boiling makes it safer, because the world is full of unseen dangers. And leaves from a nearby plant drift into the pot. The water turns faintly colored. He drinks. He feels a clarity, a lightness, a kind of clean awakening. Some versions say the leaves fell by accident. Some say the plant offered itself. Either way, the point is the same. This is how tea often enters a life, not as a plan, but as a small change in the air. Historically, we can't pin tea to a single inventor or a single afternoon. What we can say is quieter and, in its own way, more beautiful. People living in the regions where the tea plant grows naturally, parts of what is now southwestern China and surrounding areas, learned over time what those leaves could do. They chewed them, they brewed them, they mixed them with other herbs. They noticed how the body responded, how the mind changed. The earliest tea was not a delicate porcelain cup thing. It belonged to the body first. Digestion, alertness, warmth, steadiness during long hours. For a long time, tea lived close to medicine. It was something you took, like you might take bitter roots or fragrant bark. The taste was not necessarily the point, the effect was. But humans are creatures who turn useful things into meaningful ones. Give us enough time and we will decorate necessity. We will build rituals around it. We will start to care not only that it works, but that it feels a certain way. Picture a monastery in the mountains, where waking comes early. The stone floors stay cold even after sunrise, and robes are pulled tighter at the shoulders. There is work to do, sweeping, carrying water, tending to small gardens, and there is also stillness to practice. In such places, tea finds a natural home. The leaf offers wakefulness without the loud insistence of wine. It helps the mind stay upright, like a lamp kept trimmed and steady. Even the act of preparing it, the measured scoop, the waiting, resembles meditation. You cannot rush water into boiling. You cannot force leaves to open faster than they will. Over centuries, tea travels inward, from remedy to habit. It moves from the edges of life, taken only when needed, into the center, where it can be taken simply because the day has turned and a cup feels right. And as it moves, it changes form. Early tea, in many places, was processed into cakes or bricks, compressed for storage and transport. Imagine leaves steamed and pounded, shaped and dried until they become dense, portable blocks. You can carry them on a journey. You can stack them like simple green-brown currency. You can chip off pieces to boil in a pot. The tea of this era is often cooked, not steeped, simmered with other ingredients, sometimes with salt or spices, sometimes with something to make it more filling. It's not the delicate image people associate with tea now. It is sturdy. It is practical. It is made for a world where winter can cut roads and where long distance means weeks, not hours. In the dim light of a small kitchen, you might see someone shaving flakes from a tea cake, dropping them into water that is already hot, letting the surface shiver with tiny bubbles. The smell rises, green and vegetal, sometimes smoky, sometimes almost like dried flowers if the processing has been kind. In the steam, there's a hint of forests after rain. Tea is also a social thing. It gathers people, not as dramatically as a feast, but in a softer way. One cup becomes two. A visitor arrives, and you put water on. It is an offering that does not require wealth, only care. Even when tea was expensive, even when it was rare, its preparation still carried the feeling of welcome. I warmed something for you. I waited. I paid attention. That, perhaps, is why tea survives every kind of historical weather. Dynasties rise and fall. Cities burn and rebuild. Borders shift like sand. Yet the leaf endures because it speaks to a constant human desire to take something simple and make it gentle. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the old landscapes behind each cup, the misty slopes, the wet soil, the quiet hands moving through rows of pruned bushes. You can imagine the first people who noticed a change in their minds after tasting those leaves, and how, once noticed, such a thing is hard to forget. And now, in your own room, the kettle is coming to a near boil. The water is almost ready. The steam curls upward like a slow, pale ribbon, as if it is trying to write something in the air. In the next part, we'll drift forward into the first great flowering of tea culture, when attention itself becomes an art, and when a simple leaf begins to teach people how to taste, how to choose water, how to slow down on purpose. The water reaches that stage just before it truly boils, when the surface trembles, when tiny bubbles gather like secret thoughts along the bottom of the kettle. If you listen, it is not a roar yet. It is a hush with a heartbeat. In ancient China, people learned to listen to water the way they listen to wind, not for drama, but for timing. Tea, at its best, has always been less about forcing flavor and more about meeting it halfway. Now let your mind drift into the Tang dynasty, when roads were busy with officials and poets, when cities glowed with lantern light, and when a simple leaf began to rise into something like culture. In this era, tea is no longer only a remedy, it is becoming a language. And like any language, it needs grammar, shared rules, shared terms, a shared sense of what is good and what is careless. That is where one quiet figure steps forward, His name is Lu Yu. Try to picture him not as a loud inventor, but as a careful watcher, a person who notices details other people overlook. The difference between spring water and river water, the way certain leaves respond to heat, the feel of a bowl in the hands. In a world where much knowledge traveled by rumor, writing about tea in an orderly, thoughtful way was an act of attention made durable. He described tea not simply as a drink, but as a small universe, where it grows, how it's processed, what tools suit it, what kind of water makes it sing, and how the spirit of preparation changes the taste. In other words, he told people, quietly but firmly, that if you are going to do this, do it with care. And care is, in many ways, the theme of tea history. In Tang times, tea was often made from compressed forms, cakes and bricks, sturdy shapes you could stack and carry, less vulnerable on long journeys than loose leaves. People would break off pieces, roast or grind them, and boil them. It could be robust, sometimes mixed with other ingredients depending on region and custom. It was a drink built for movement, for caravans, for couriers, for monasteries, for households that needed something steady in the cold. But even as the method was practical, the meaning was already becoming refined. Tea houses and social drinking grew. A cup could be offered with the same subtle grace as a poem. And the objects around tea, kettles, bowls, small boxes for leaves, began to matter not only as tools, but as companions to experience. Now, very gently, we drift forward into the Song dynasty, where tea becomes something even more delicate, even more playful in its seriousness. Song tea culture is famous for whisked tea, finely ground tea whisked with hot water into a pale foam. Imagine a bowl held steady in two hands, a fine powder like soft green dust, and a whisk moving quickly, fast enough to pull air into the liquid until the surface blooms into froth. And because humans cannot resist turning skill into sport, there were competitions, tea duels, where people compared the quality of the foam, the smoothness of the taste, the purity of color. It's strangely soothing to think of. In an age without electricity, without screens, people gathered to judge something as quiet as a bowl of foam. The drama was contained. The stakes were small. The reward was beauty. If you close your eyes, you can hear the tiny sounds, the whisk tapping the bowl, the soft breath of someone concentrating, the murmur of onlookers. Outside, perhaps, a courtyard with winter sunlight. Inside, the warmth of bodies and the clean, green scent of tea. But tea history does not move in a straight line. It pivots. It changes when politics changes, when labor becomes too heavy, when rulers decide that a tradition is too costly. So we come to another turning, one that will shape the way many of us recognize tea today. As time passed, loose-leaf tea rose in importance. Processing methods shifted. Leaves were handled differently. New styles developed, and slowly, the everyday cup changed from something boiled from compressed chunks into something steeped from leaves that unfurl like small green birds waking in hot water. Think about that unfurling. It is one of the gentlest transformations in any kitchen. Dry leaves, tight, curled, asleep, meeting heat and becoming themselves again. The scent rises, subtle and clean. The water takes color gradually, as if it is remembering how. In that simple motion, leaves opening, you can almost see history opening too. Early attention, later artistry, reforms and new habits, all drifting forward into the cup you might hold tonight, And the kettle in your room has finally reached a true boil. Not angry, just complete. Ready. In the next part, we'll linger with the sensory world that tea invites. Water sources, vessels, the small choices that turn a drink into a practice. We'll keep it slow. We'll keep it warm. Let the boil settle for a moment. If you lift the kettle off the heat, the sound changes immediately. From that full, rolling insistence into something softer, like a crowd that has been asked to lower its voice. The steam still rises, but now it curls instead of rushing. This is the first lesson tea teaches without words. Not everything needs to be at maximum to be ready. In the old traditions of tea, water is not just water. It has moods. It has stages. Some people described it with images: fish eyes, crab eyes, pearls, tiny bubbles growing and changing as heat builds. The point wasn't poetry for its own sake. The point was noticing. If you pay attention, you stop guessing. If you stop guessing, you stop rushing. And if you stop rushing, tea becomes easier to love. Imagine a person walking to a spring early in the morning, before the village is fully woken. The path is damp. The air tastes faintly of stone. They carry a jar or a small covered vessel, careful not to stir up mud near the edge. Spring water was prized, not because it was magical, but because it often tasted clean and lively, and because it carried fewer heavy flavors than stagnant pools or slow, silty rivers. But even spring water is not always good. Some springs taste metallic. Some taste too mineral, like licking a smooth rock. Some are so cold and sharp they make tea feel thin. So people learned to choose. They learned to compare. They learned that the same leaves can seem dull or bright, depending on what meets them. This is where tea becomes more than a drink. It becomes a way of perceiving. Now picture the vessels. Before porcelain became common and cheap, bowls and cups were not disposable objects. They were companions, sometimes passed down, sometimes carried carefully, sometimes repaired rather than replaced. A crack did not always mean ruined. A crack meant, this has been used, this has served, this has lived. Even today, in certain traditions, a repaired bowl can feel more precious than a flawless one because it proves that time has touched it and it stayed. In the Tang world, tea might be prepared with tools that feel unfamiliar now: grinders, sieves, small braziers, kettles with soot-darkened bottoms. In the song world, the whisk becomes a symbol. Thin strands, flexible, quick, able to bring air and water and leaf into a single texture. And later, as loose leaf steeping grows more common, the teapot begins to take its quiet throne, not as a loud centerpiece, but as a practical little house for leaves. If you've ever watched leaves steep in a glass or clear pot, you've seen how alive it looks. Leaves rise, fall, rotate slowly. They surrender their flavor in layers, not all at once. The first infusion can be light and fragrant, the next deeper, the next more rounded. Tea, in that way, has an almost conversational patience. It doesn't shout everything at the beginning. It reveals itself as you stay. Now, let's wander for a moment into a tea room, real or imagined, it doesn't matter. The room is not large. It doesn't need to be. The walls hold quiet. There may be a small table, or perhaps just mats and low seating. A kettle warms somewhere nearby. The host moves with unhurried precision. Nothing is wasted. Motions are small. There is a kind of respect in the economy of movement, like a dancer who doesn't need big gestures to be understood. And the guests, maybe two, maybe three, are not there to be entertained with fireworks. They are there to share attention. That is the difference between tea and many other social rituals. Tea doesn't ask you to get louder. Tea asks you to get clearer. When the water meets the leaves, there is a moment of scent that feels like opening a drawer where linen has been stored with herbs. It rises and disappears. If you were distracted, you'd miss it. If you were present, it would be enough. This idea that tea rewards attention spreads along with the leaf itself. It's one reason tea becomes tied to art, to poetry, to philosophy. Not because tea contains philosophy, but because tea creates the conditions in which philosophy becomes possible. A warm body, a quiet mind, a small pause that stretches. Now, though, the story needs to move, because tea does not stay in its misty birthplace. It travels. It becomes cargo. It becomes a reason for roads and ships and arguments. And when something soft and daily becomes valuable, it starts to attract harder things: taxes, monopolies, borders, violence. That is not tea's fault. It is simply what humans do to comfort when it becomes scarce. So, in the next part, we will follow tea outward, first by land, through long, patient caravan routes, where tea is pressed into bricks and traded for horses, salt, and survival. We will feel the cold air of high plateaus, where tea is not delicate at all, but thick and nourishing. And then, slowly, we will smell the salt of the sea, where ships carry tea toward entirely new mouths, new languages, new kinds of desire. For now, though, let your cup be simple. Feel the warmth through the ceramic. Let it steady your hands. Take one sip, not to analyze, not to judge, but to mark this moment as real. A quiet cup in a quiet room, and a story unfolding like leaves in hot water. Now we leave the room. Not quickly, not with a slam of a door. We simply let the warmth remain behind us, like a lamp left lit, and we step into wider air. Tea begins its long travels the way most things did for most of history, on the backs of animals, in the patience of human feet, in the slow arithmetic of distance. A day's travel is a day's travel. Winter can erase it. Rain can turn it to mud. Mountains can make it feel endless. So tea becomes a shape suited for endurance. Imagine tea pressed into bricks, dense, dark blocks with the faint scent of vegetation trapped inside. They are practical, easier to carry, harder to spoil, simpler to count. In some places, tea bricks behave almost like currency. You can trade them, stack them, ration them. You can shave off what you need and keep the rest safe. A leaf becomes a unit. A cup becomes a measure of time. Now picture a caravan road. The sky is enormous, pale blue at noon and startlingly full of stars at night. The wind has a dry edge. Hooves strike packed earth. There is the creak of leather, the soft complaint of a burdened animal, the occasional low call between travelers. Somewhere among the bundles, wrapped in cloth, sealed against moisture, are bricks of tea. On routes that connect tea-growing regions with the northern steppes and the high plateaus, tea is not just a pleasant drink. It is a kind of nutritional tool, a warm anchor for bodies living in cold, thin air. Where vegetables are rare for long months, where diets rely heavily on meat and dairy, tea brings something sharp and balancing. It cuts through fat. It steadies the stomach. It offers a sense of freshness when the landscape is mostly stone and sky. And in places like Tibet and Mongolia, tea changes again, because culture is a kind of alchemy. Here, tea might be brewed strong and then churned with salt and butter, sometimes with milk, becoming a thick, sustaining drink that feels closer to soup than to tea in the delicate sense. If you imagine it, imagine the warmth first. A bowl held in both hands, steam rising, the surface glistening. The taste is savory, rich, grounding. It is the kind of drink that says, you can keep going. It's a different answer to the same question. In a damp tea hillside, the question is, how do we savor this leaf? In a high, cold plateau, the question is, how do we survive winter, wind, and altitude? Tea is flexible enough to serve both. Now, while caravans move across land, another kind of movement begins to matter more and more. Movement by sea. Ships are hungry things. They eat time. They eat attention. They demand ropes and repairs and constant vigilance. But they can carry what caravans cannot. Large quantities across vast distances with a kind of relentless efficiency. The sea does not care about borders. It cares about weather. As European traders expand their routes through Asia, they encounter tea first as one more remarkable commodity among many, alongside spices, silks, lacquerware, porcelain. At first, it is unfamiliar. The taste is subtle compared to heavily spiced drinks. But subtlety, once learned, can become addictive. Picture a warehouse in a port city. The air smells of wood, salt, and tar. There are stacks of crates. A man with ink-stained fingers checks lists, counts bundles, argues about weight. Somewhere, packed carefully, are chests of tea, sealed to protect them from moisture, from smells, from the ruin of sea air. Tea is a leaf, and leaves absorb their surroundings. A careless shipment can taste like the ship itself, rope and resin and damp. So people learn, again, to be careful. And the moment tea arrives in a new place, it begins its second life, the life of interpretation. A merchant might brew it too strong, scalding it, and decide it is bitter. Another might brew it lightly and find it gentle. Some add sugar, because sugar is already part of the European taste for exotic luxuries, and because sweetness can make unfamiliar things feel safe. Some add milk, turning tea into something rounder, softer, more like comfort. And once tea meets sugar, a whole new set of shadows follows. Plantations, coerced labor, economies built on sweetness and suffering. Tea is rarely alone. It travels with other goods and with the systems that produce them. But for now, stay with the first moments. Imagine the first time someone in a European household lifts a cup of tea and smells it. They may not have words for it yet. It is not floral, not vegetal, not nutty. Those vocabularies develop later, like any vocabulary does, through repetition and shared experience. At first, it is simply strange, warm, clean. And perhaps they drink it in silence, because the taste asks for silence. The leaf, once rooted in misty hills, has now crossed deserts and oceans. It has been pressed into bricks, churned with butter, sealed into chests, carried through storms. It has survived the human desire to reshape it. This is the point in the story where tea begins to become expensive in a new way. Not only because it is rare, but because it is wrapped in distance, and distance, in the age of sail, is paid for with risk. In the next part, we'll step into the early European tea world more fully, the Dutch trading networks, the first steady markets, and the way tea enters a city like London, first as a fashionable novelty, then as a habit, then as a daily need. We'll also begin to feel how quickly a gentle drink can become tangled in taxes, smuggling, and politics. But tonight, let's keep the pace slow. Let the caravan bells fade into the wind. Let the sea settle. Let the idea of a leaf traveling for months just to meet your cup make you a little quieter, a little more grateful, without needing to do anything about it except breathe. London does not discover tea all at once. It arrives the way fog arrives, softly, then suddenly everywhere. At first, tea is a whisper among wealthy households and curious merchants. A new scent drifting out of a small porcelain cup. A dark liquid poured carefully, because the leaves that made it are expensive, and because expensive things invite a certain kind of reverence, even when people don't quite understand them yet. Imagine a narrow street near a bustling river, the air heavy with coal smoke and damp wool. Somewhere inside a paneled room, a kettle warms. A servant sets down a tray. Someone speaks of ships and ports, of foreign goods, of the astonishing distance a leaf can travel. And then tea is offered, almost like a test. Will you like it? Will you understand it? Will you pretend you do? In the 17th century, European trading companies begin to bring tea more reliably. The Dutch play an early role in expanding the trade, and tea becomes part of the broader world of Asian commodities, porcelain, silk, spices, flowing into European markets. In that world, tea is not just a beverage, it is a signal. It says, we have connections, we have access, we have the means to purchase the far away. But signals rarely stay signals. When something truly fits human life, it spreads beyond fashion. Tea begins to appear in coffee houses, those noisy, smoky rooms where men argue about politics, ships, philosophy, and money. Coffee houses were social engines of the era. Tea, initially, is one more option on the menu, one more taste of the world. Yet tea has a different temperament than coffee. Coffee pushes, tea invites, and some people prefer invitation. Meanwhile, inside homes, tea begins to shape a new kind of domestic ritual. It's easy to romanticize this, but the truth is quieter. Tea is hot, safe to drink when water is not, and it can be shared. And once you start sharing tea at home, you start building a small structure around it. Cups, pots, a place to store leaves, a habit of keeping sugar nearby, perhaps milk. Habits create furniture, and furniture creates tradition. Now, let's talk about the sweetness that follows tea into Britain like a shadow. In the early days, tea is often drunk plain or lightly sweetened. But as sugar becomes more common in British consumption patterns, sweet tea becomes a comfort. Sugar does something simple. It makes bitterness less frightening. It makes the unfamiliar feel friendly. A spoonful transforms the cup from strange leaf water into something closer to dessert, or at least closer to softness. But sugar also ties tea to a global system of labor and extraction. plantations and shipping lanes and the steady appetite of empire. In the warm glow of a tea table, it's easy to forget the heat of the fields where sugarcane is cut. History has this double vision, one moment cozy, the next moment harsh. And then there are the objects. Porcelain becomes part of tea's story in Europe, not only because it is beautiful, but because it is practical. It holds heat without tasting like metal. It feels clean. It looks refined. People begin to collect tea sets. Cups become smaller and more delicate. Saucers appear as a way to catch drips and protect tables. Even the act of holding a cup changes the body posture. Fingers pinch, wrists lift, shoulders settle. Tea teaches a posture of restraint. And as tea becomes more popular, it becomes a problem for the state. Because anything widely desired becomes a source of revenue. Taxes rise. Import duties grow. The price of legal tea climbs, and with it, the temptation to avoid paying. So another London appears alongside the fashionable one, the London of smugglers. Picture the coast at night, where the sea is black and the wind is sharp. Small boats slide toward shore. Bundles are passed quickly, carried into hidden storage, moved inland by people who know the paths that avoid officials. In towns and villages, illicit tea is sold quietly, cheaper than the taxed version, sometimes mixed with other leaves to stretch it further. Some tea is not tea at all, but a blend of dried plants dyed to look right. When demand is strong, deception grows around it like mold. The government responds with more enforcement. Smugglers respond with new routes. And ordinary people, who simply want their daily comfort, become part of the system without intending to. A cup of tea becomes a small decision, lawful or not, expensive or affordable, pure or questionable. It's almost comical in a tired way that something as gentle as tea ends up in such rough hands. But this is what happens when a habit becomes a necessity. Tea shifts from luxury to daily life. And daily life is big. It is larger than law, larger than fashion, larger than the people who tried to control it. Somewhere in all of this, a quieter tradition is forming too. Tea as a moment in the day. Not a ceremony, not a competition, not a political symbol. Just a pause. You can imagine a family in a small home, windows fogged with breath in winter. Someone pours a weak brew because leaves are precious. Someone adds a little milk. Someone shares a piece of bread. The cup warms their hands. The day becomes more bearable. And when enough people find bearable in the same place, the nation changes. In the next part, we'll step into the machinery behind the British tea obsession, the ledgers, the monopolies, the larger forces that tried to turn tea into an instrument of power. We'll also start to feel the tension between Britain and Qing China, because Britain wants more tea than it can easily pay for, and China has its own rules, its own confidence, its own limits. For now, let the smugglers fade back into night. Let the tea table remain. Let the cup return to what it always wanted to be. Warmth in the hands, a small kindness, a pause that doesn't ask for anything except your presence. Now the story widens again, not into romance, into paperwork. Because once tea becomes a national habit, it stops being merely a product. It becomes a river of money. And wherever money flows, someone builds a dam and tries to control it. Imagine an office with tall windows and gray light. The air smells of ink and damp wool. Ledgers lie open like heavy doors. Men in plain coats run their fingers down columns of numbers, calculating costs in a world where a storm at sea can erase a year's profit. They speak in calm voices about chests, weights, duties, freight, spoilage. They are not thinking about the softness of steam above a cup. They are thinking about how many cups can be turned into power. In Britain, the East India Company becomes the central mechanism for this. It is not merely a group of merchants. Over time, it functions like a state within a state, armed, bureaucratic, ambitious. It negotiates, it coerces, it builds systems. Tea becomes one of the pillars of its business because tea is steady. People may skip luxuries in hard times, but they cling to comforts. Tea is a comfort that feels respectable. So Britain wants tea. It wants more and more of it. But there is a problem, and it's a quiet kind of problem. Trade imbalance. For a long stretch of time, China is willing to sell tea, porcelain, silk, goods Europeans crave, but is less interested in buying European-manufactured goods in return. China wants silver. Britain pays in silver. And silver, like blood, is not something an empire wants to keep losing. The outflow becomes a worry. The habit has a cost. Now picture the Chinese side of the trade. Foreign merchants are not free to wander anywhere they like. Trade is structured, controlled. For long periods, much of the legal foreign trade funnels through a limited system centered on Canton, present-day Guangzhou, where foreign traders deal with licensed Chinese merchants and follow strict regulations. Foreigners live in designated areas, their movement restricted, their access managed. They are tolerated because trade is useful, but they are not invited to belong. From Britain's perspective, this feels like a door that is only opened a crack. They want it wider. They want direct access, better terms, more control. And when a powerful empire is frustrated, it rarely stays polite forever. At this point, the story grows darker, not because tea itself is dark, but because Britain begins to look for a lever. If China wants silver, Britain needs something China will accept in large quantities, something that can reverse the flow. And that something becomes opium. Opium is not introduced as a harmless trade item. It is a drug, highly addictive, destructive to bodies and communities. But it is profitable. And profit has a way of numbing conscience when distance exists, when those harmed are far away, when their suffering cannot be seen from a tea table in London. Opium, grown and processed largely in British-controlled India, begins to be sold illegally into China. Silver starts flowing back out of China in exchange. The ledger books begin to look better for Britain, even as Chinese society pays an immense price. Chinese authorities attempt to stop it. They seize shipments, they punish dealers, they insist on sovereignty, on the right to control what enters their country. This is not simply a moral stance. It is an attempt to stop a national crisis. Tensions rise, diplomacy frays, and eventually conflict breaks. What history remembers as the Opium Wars. It can feel strange, almost surreal, to connect a warm cup of tea with warships. But that is the truth of global commodities. Comfort at one end can mean coercion at the other. Tea is the desire. Opium becomes the weaponized answer. When the wars end, treaties reshape the trade landscape in ways that favor Britain and other foreign powers. Ports open, terms shift. Hong Kong becomes a British colony. The old trading constraints loosen under pressure. The world becomes, for better and worse, more connected. Connected by force as much as by curiosity. And through it all, tea keeps moving. Chests of leaves still cross oceans. Cups still steam on tables. People still sip, still add sugar, still talk about weather and family, while history churns underneath their hands like a dark current. Now, if you need a softer place to rest for a moment, imagine the leaf itself, small, green, quietly growing on a hillside that does not care about treaties. The plant continues. Seasons continue. The mist arrives each morning, whether an empire is satisfied or not. But the human story does not release tea so easily. Because once Britain realizes how dangerous it is to rely entirely on Chinese tea supplies, once it realizes that politics can threaten the flow of leaves, it begins to dream of independence. If they could grow tea under their own control, they could reduce reliance on China. They could protect their habit. They could keep the profits within their system. They could make tea not only a drink, but a fully owned machine. And that leads us toward another turning in the story. The expansion of tea cultivation in British-controlled territories, especially in India, and later in Ceylon. This next chapter of tea is full of foggy hill stations, botanical experiments, railways, plantations, labor, and marketing. Tea not as art, but as industry. We will walk through it slowly, because even industry has its quiet details. The sound of leaves being rolled, the smell of withering rooms, the long rows of bushes shaped by human hands. For now, though, let the darker waters settle. Take a breath that is not hurried. Remember that history is not asked to be carried all at once. You can hold a cup and still acknowledge the world behind it. You can let the warmth be real without pretending the shadows were not. In the next part, we'll follow the leaf into new lands, into Assam, where tea grows in a different way than Britain expected, and into the hills of Darjeeling, where altitude and cool air turn tea into something delicate again, even under the hard geometry of empire. Now the leaf is no longer only a traveler. Now it is something people try to capture. There is a particular kind of ambition that looks at a living plant and sees not beauty, but leverage. If Britain could grow tea in its own sphere of control, then tea would stop being a dependence and become a domestic engine, something measured, harvested, taxed, shipped, sold, and defended without asking permission from distant authorities. So the gaze turns south and east toward India. For a while, there is a stubborn assumption in the European mind that real tea is Chinese, and that the tea plant belongs to China in the way a secret belongs to a locked room. But nature has never respected national boundaries. Plants follow climate, altitude, rainfall, soil. And in the far northeast of India, in the humid, green region of Assam, tea was already growing. Not in neat rows, not in the tidy vision of a plantation, but as wild or semi-wild bushes and trees that local communities had known and used. The leaf was there before the imperial plan arrived. That fact, simple, quiet, undercuts the fantasy that tea could only be taken by theft. Sometimes the world has already placed what you want within reach. The tragedy is what humans do next to claim it. Assam becomes one of the first great centers of tea cultivation under British influence. Forest is cleared, land is surveyed, parceled, reshaped. Where tea had been part of a living landscape, it is turned into an organized field. Bushes are pruned to uniform heights. Pathways are cut between rows. The leaf becomes an industrial promise. And to make the promise real, people are required. Tea does not harvest itself. It requires fingers. Tender leaves must be plucked at the right time, often the youngest bud and the next leaves, because those contain the sweetness and complexity people will pay for. Plucking is repetitive, delicate work. It is measured in baskets and weighed at day's end. It is also exhausting. So labor systems expand, and with them come hard realities. Recruitment, coercion, poverty, disease, and the uneven power of estate life. The romantic image of tea gardens is often built on invisible suffering. If you stand far enough away, a plantation can look serene, green rows under mist. Up close, it is also heat, insects, aching backs, and the strict discipline of quotas. And yet, despite the harshness of the system, tea itself continues to be what it is, a plant that responds to care, weather, and time. That is one of the strange contradictions in human history. People can build cruel structures around something delicate, and the delicate thing will still produce beauty. Now let us drift upward, away from Assam's heavy humidity, into the hills. Darjeeling. Even the name sounds like a breath. Here the air is cooler, the slopes are steep. The mornings can be wrapped in cloud so thick it feels like walking inside a soft gray fabric. Tea grown at higher altitude tends to grow more slowly. Slower growth can mean more complex flavors, subtle aromatics, a clarity people struggle to describe. Some later call certain Darjeeling teas muscatel, comparing a note in the cup to grapes, not because there are grapes in the leaves, but because the mind reaches for familiar sweetness when something is refined. In these hills, the British build their hill stations and estates, partly for cultivation, partly for escape from lowland heat, partly for the illusion of a gentler empire, an empire that can breathe cooler air and pretend for a moment that power is simply order. Railways creep into the mountains because tea must move. Leaves are picked in the morning and cannot wait forever. Processing needs timing. Shipping needs schedules. A leaf is small, but the economy built around it becomes heavy, and heavy things need tracks. Now, come closer to the processing rooms. This is where the leaf changes into what you recognize as tea. Fresh leaves are spread out to wither, losing moisture, becoming softer, more pliable. The room smells green, like cut grass and rain. Then the leaves are rolled. Rolling bruises the leaf, breaking cell walls, releasing juices, starting transformations. In black tea production, the leaves are then left to oxidize, air meeting leaf in a slow chemical conversation, until the color deepens and the aroma shifts toward fruit, malt, honey, or wood. Then heat stops the process, drying the leaf into something stable for travel. There is something hypnotic about it. The idea that a leaf can be guided through stages the way dough becomes bread. Its craft, scaled up, repeated day after day. And while India becomes a major answer to Britain's desire for controlled tea, another transformation happens on an island farther south. Ceylon, today Sri Lanka, was once more associated with coffee and colonial export dreams. But coffee cultivation suffered a disaster, a plant disease, coffee leaf rust, which devastated coffee estates. In that ruin, tea found an opening. The hills that could no longer sustain coffee became tea land. The infrastructure shifted. Estates were replanted. A new identity grew in rows of green. Ceylon tea becomes a brand, a global flavor, a reliable black tea for many markets. And again the pattern repeats. Beautiful hills, careful cultivation, and a labor reality that is often overlooked in the cozy glow of a cup. Tea, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is no longer simply Chinese tea or exotic tea. It is a global commodity. It has multiple homelands now, not because the plant changed, but because power and agriculture forced it into new shapes. And then something else happens. Tea must be sold not only as a product, but as an idea. Because if you grow vast amounts of tea, you need vast amounts of drinkers. So advertising and social habit begin to intertwine. Tea becomes associated with respectability, with comfort, with daily rhythm. In Britain, it becomes a national drink, a symbol of steady life. In India, tea consumption is encouraged and shaped, becoming both a colonial industry and, eventually, a deeply local habit in its own right. But before we get to the street corners and railway stations where chai steams in metal cups, we should pause in a different place, across the sea, in Japan, where tea is not pushed into empire's machinery in the same way, but is woven into aesthetics, ceremony, and a philosophy of attention so precise it feels like listening to snowfall. In the next part, we'll drift into Japan. How tea arrives, how it changes, how matcha becomes a ritual of quiet, and how an everyday green tea, sencha, later becomes part of modern life. It will be a softer chapter, a chapter of small rooms, careful hands, and silence that feels kind. For now, let the image of the tea leaf remain, first wild, then cultivated, then disciplined into rose. A small green thing that keeps offering itself to hot water again and again, while humans argue above it like weather. Cross a narrow stretch of sea, leave behind the geometry of plantations and the heavy logic of empire for a moment, and step into a different kind of quiet, one shaped less by scale and more by precision. Tea arrives in Japan through the movement of monks, books, and seeds. It is carried at first, not as mass cargo, but as a practice, something that belongs in temples, in study, in the disciplined rhythms of spiritual life. Imagine a small pouch of seeds tucked into a sleeve, brought home after years abroad. A gift not meant for profit, but for cultivation in the broadest sense, the cultivation of mind and body. In early Japanese tea history, the leaf is tied closely to Buddhism. Monks drink tea to stay awake during long hours of meditation and chanting. The body is asked to be still. The mind is asked to be clear. Tea helps. It offers alertness that doesn't feel like agitation. It sharpens without shouting. Now picture a temple garden on a cool morning. The air is clean. The stones are damp. A rake has drawn lines through gravel like ripples frozen in time. Somewhere behind paper screens, water is warming. Tea is prepared not as a casual beverage, but as a small act of care, performed with attention that is, itself, a kind of prayer. Over centuries, tea in Japan develops into something both aesthetic and philosophical. The tea ceremony, known as chanoyu, chado, or sado, the way of tea. But it's important to understand what ceremony means here. It doesn't mean spectacle. It means refinement of the ordinary. It means taking a simple act, making a bowl of tea, and doing it so thoughtfully that the act becomes a mirror for how you live. In a tea room, nothing is random. The entrance may be low, so you bow to enter, whether you intend to or not. The room is small, often minimally decorated. A scroll may hang in a simple alcove. A single flower may be arranged so naturally it looks as though it grew there. The point is not decoration. The point is presence. The host prepares matcha, powdered green tea, by sifting it, placing it into a bowl, adding hot water, and whisking until a fine foam forms on the surface. The whisking is brisk, but the atmosphere is calm. Each movement has been learned, practiced, simplified. The hands know where to go. The mind is free to rest inside the motion. And then the bowl is offered. One bowl, shared among guests in traditional settings. The bowl is turned slightly before drinking, a gesture of respect, partly to avoid drinking from the front, partly to acknowledge the object and the moment. The tea is thick, vivid green, slightly bitter, slightly sweet, intensely alive. It tastes like plants and spring and clean fields. It tastes like attention. There is a phrase often associated with the spirit of tea in Japan, wabi-sabi, the appreciation of simplicity, imperfection, transience. A bowl might be uneven, a glaze might crack, a texture might be rough. That roughness is not a flaw, it is a reminder. Nothing lasts, so notice it while it's here. Tea becomes a practice of noticing. It can be soothing to imagine this. A world where the highest luxury is not more noise, but fewer distractions. But Japan is not only ceremony. Tea does not remain locked in a small room forever. Over time, another style of tea becomes central to daily life. Sencha, an infused green tea made from steamed leaves rather than powdered leaf. The process of steaming helps preserve a fresh, vegetal character. When you brew it, the aroma can feel like sea air mixed with cut grass, like something crisp and bright. Sencha becomes the everyday cup, the tea of ordinary homes, shops, and conversations. It is less formal than matcha, easier to prepare, suited to regular life. And in that shift, we see again the familiar pattern. Tea begins in specialized settings, monasteries, elites, refined circles, and then becomes something broader, something shared. Japan also develops other teas. Gyokuro, shaded to deepen sweetness. Hojicha, roasted until it smells like warm toast. Genmaicha, blended with roasted rice, comforting and nutty. Each is an answer to a different mood, a different season, a different kind of hunger. Now, let's pause and feel the difference between these tea worlds. In one branch of tea history, tea becomes a commodity moved in vast quantities, shaped by markets and colonial structures. In another branch, tea becomes a discipline of care, shaped by aesthetics and philosophy. Both branches are true. Both belong to the same plant. The leaf is versatile enough to hold contradictions. And even while Japan refines tea into quiet art, tea elsewhere continues to spread into daily rhythms, into Russia with its samovars and long caravan routes, into India with spiced milk tea poured from kettles at railway stations, into America with iced tea in summer heat. We will go there soon, but for now, stay in the small room. Listen to the whisk against the bowl, soft, quick, like rain against bamboo. Notice how the host sets down the scoop, wipes the rim, turns the bowl, not to impress, but to honor. Notice how the guests speak little, because the room itself is speaking in textures, the grain of wood, the warmth of ceramic, the silence between breaths. Tea, in this form, is a way of returning to the present. And that is why it belongs so naturally in a story meant to help you rest. It asks you to move slowly. It rewards you for paying attention to almost nothing. In the next part, we'll move into colder landscapes, northward, across long roads where tea travels for months in caravans, and into Russian homes where the samovar becomes a warm metal heart in winter. We'll see how tea becomes a companion to snowlight, jam, and the long, dark afternoons. For now, imagine the last sip of matcha. It leaves a green trace on the tongue, a gentle bitterness that feels clean rather than harsh. The bowl is warm. The room is quiet. And outside, somewhere beyond the paper screens, the world continues, softened for a moment by steam. Now the air grows colder, the kind of cold that makes sound travel farther, that turns breath into something visible, that makes a warm drink feel less like a preference and more like a necessity. To follow tea into Russia is to follow it into distance. For centuries, tea reached Russia primarily by land, moving in long caravans from China across Mongolia and Siberia. This was not a quick trade. It was a slow migration of cargo, months of travel over steppe and forest, over frozen ground and muddy thaw, through a world where the horizon can feel endless and human presence feels small. Imagine a line of pack animals moving steadily through snow. The bells are not cheerful. They are practical, a way to keep track in white weather. The caravan stops at night in shelters or simple camps. Tea, often packed in bricks or tightly sealed chests, is guarded not because it is glamorous, but because it is valuable, and because the journey itself has already invested so much time into those leaves. By the time the tea reaches Moscow or St. Petersburg, it has absorbed the story of its travel. The dryness of cold air, the scent of wood smoke from roadside fires, the faint pressure of long storage. Some people later romanticize caravan tea, imagining that it gained a special smoothness or smoky nuance from the road. Whether or not every shipment truly carried such flavor, the idea itself makes sense. When something takes months to arrive, you taste the months. And once tea becomes part of Russian life, it develops a personality suited to Russian winters. The samovar appears as a central figure, part appliance, part hearth. Picture it, a heavy metal vessel, rounded and shining dully in lamplight, standing on a table like a small, patient monument. Inside, water stays hot for hours. Traditionally, there's a heat source in the center, charcoal, embers, something glowing and steady. The samovar does not merely boil water, it holds warmth in place. In a cold house, that matters. Around the samovar, tea becomes a gathering, not necessarily a formal ceremony, but a social gravity. People sit close, talk, pause, listen. The samovar hums softly, sometimes with a faint singing sound as the water shifts inside. Cups are poured and refilled. Time stretches. Russian tea is often prepared with a strong concentrate called zavarka, very strong brewed tea kept in a small teapot. A little of this concentrate is poured into a cup, then diluted with hot water from the samovar. This makes tea flexible, strong for someone who wants it bracing, light for someone who wants it gentle. It also makes tea economical. A small amount of leaf can serve many cups. Now add the other comforts that join tea in Russian tradition. Jam, spooned onto the tongue and then chased with hot tea. Lemon slices floating in a glass held in a metal holder. Sometimes sugar, sometimes honey. The tea itself may be dark and robust, built to stand up to sweetness and cold. Imagine the scene: a window rimmed with frost. Outside, snow muffles the street. Inside, light pools on the table. Someone breaks a small piece of sugar and holds it between teeth, sipping tea through it. Someone else laughs quietly. Someone stirs jam into a saucer. The samovar stands at the center like a warm animal. Tea here is not about delicate notes. It is about endurance. It warms hands that have been outside too long. It fills the silence of long afternoons. It gives people a reason to sit, to rest, to share a moment without having to invent one. And there is something else, too. Tea as patience. Because in Russia, tea's arrival by caravan meant that tea was always, in a way, a lesson in waiting. Tea teaches waiting in every culture, but here the waiting is built into the supply chain itself. If tea takes months to arrive, you don't treat it as something you gulp thoughtlessly. You treat it as something that traveled. Now, as tea becomes more common, it becomes less rare, and the ritual broadens. It becomes a drink not just for the elite, but for ordinary households. It becomes part of hospitality, something you offer to a guest, something you set out when someone visits, something that smooths conversation. Even when food is scarce, tea can be offered. It costs less than a feast, but it says the same thing: you matter enough to warm water. Across cultures, tea has this power. It is the simplest form of hosting: heat and leaf, shared. Now, while Russia is shaping tea into a companion for snow, tea in another place is preparing to become loud in a different way. Not loud in sound, but loud in scent. India. Not the plantation tea of export ledgers, but the tea of streets and stations. The tea that boils with milk and spice. The tea poured from height to aerate and cool it just enough to drink. The tea held in small glasses, hot enough to sting the fingers, sweet enough to feel like mercy. In the next part, we'll move into that world. Masala chai, railways, the chaiwala, and the strange story of how tea had to be marketed to people living in tea-growing lands, how a colonial commodity became, over time, a deeply loved local habit. For now, let the snow settle outside the window. Let the samovar's warmth linger in your mind like a small sun contained in metal. Let the idea of tea as gathered warmth, portable, shareable, slow, carry you gently forward. The cold of the Russian window fades. In its place comes a different kind of heat, dense, fragrant, full of movement. India's tea story has two faces. One is the vastness of estates, rows of bushes across hills, processing rooms, export chests, ships. The other is intimate and immediate. A small stall by a road, a kettle darkened by use, steam carrying the scent of ginger and cardamom into the air. This second face is the one that most people remember in their bodies, because masala chai is not subtle. It announces itself. Imagine a railway platform. The air is dusty. The sun presses down. People wait with bags at their feet, fanning themselves with folded paper, or simply enduring. Trains arrive with a metallic shriek and a wind of grit. Doors open, voices rise, The world is hot, restless, alive. And then you hear it, call after call, rhythmic, familiar. Chai. A chai seller moves along the platform with a kettle or a metal container, pouring the tea into small cups. Sometimes the cups are glass. Sometimes, in older traditions, they are unglazed clay cups that hold heat and then are discarded, an earthy, temporary vessel that makes each drink feel like a small event. The tea is sweet, milky, strong, and spiced. It is warmth and sugar and caffeine, three reliable tools for surviving a long day. Masala chai is made by boiling tea, not merely steeping it. Black tea leaves, often robust, grown to withstand milk, are simmered with water, milk, sugar, and spices. Common spices include cardamom, ginger, cloves, cinnamon, and black pepper. Sometimes fennel, sometimes star anise, sometimes whatever is available. Every family, every stall, every region develops its own balance, and that balance matters. Too much ginger, and it bites. Too much clove, and it becomes medicinal. Too much cardamom, and it turns perfumed, almost floral. But when it's right, it's like a warm blanket with edges of brightness. A drink that wakes you and comforts you at the same time. Now, the strange part of this story is that tea, despite growing abundantly in parts of India, was not always a widespread daily drink for everyone. Large-scale tea cultivation expanded under colonial systems largely for export. The leaf was grown, processed, shipped away. The habit of tea drinking at the scale of a nation had to be encouraged and shaped. There is something quietly unsettling about that. A plant cultivated in your land, turned into profit elsewhere, then marketed back to you as an everyday need. But history is full of such loops. As tea becomes more present in urban life, as railways expand and people move, chai becomes a democratic drink. It doesn't belong to a palace or a temple. It belongs to streets, markets, workshops, and stations. It belongs to conversation between strangers. It belongs to brief rests during long labor. If you've ever stood beside a busy road in the evening, you know the feeling. The day beginning to cool, the sky turning pale, the body tired, the mind buzzing. A cup of chai is a small reset. The warmth steadies the stomach. The sweetness softens the nerves. The spice clears the head as if opening windows inside you. And chai is also social. In many places, let's have chai is not really about the drink. It's about the pause, the chance to talk, the permission to sit down. The way the world becomes briefly smaller around a steaming cup. Now, think about the sound of making chai. The clatter of a spoon against a pot. The soft roar of boiling milk. The moment the tea rises, frothing up, threatening to spill, and the maker lifts the pot quickly to calm it. That dance with the boil, up and down, is its own kind of rhythm. It's almost hypnotic, like watching waves that never quite break. Chai is also often poured from height, stream to cup, to aerate it and cool it slightly, and to mix it fully. The long ribbon of tea looks like liquid bronze. It splashes, steams, and settles. The cup is filled. A hand takes it carefully, fingers pinched around hot glass. The first sip burns just a little. Then the body relaxes. Tea here is no longer a distant luxury. It's an everyday heartbeat. And yet, even as chai becomes beloved, tea's global story keeps branching. Somewhere else, tea is becoming chilled, served over ice, sweetened heavily, made for summer. Somewhere else, tea is being sealed into small paper bags, convenience turning ritual into routine. Somewhere else, tea is being bottled, flavored, branded, shipped, refrigerated. Somewhere else, tea is being shaken with tapioca pearls, turned playful and chewy, something you sip through a wide straw. Tea keeps changing, because humans keep changing their days. In the next part, we'll step toward the modern era. How tea becomes standardized, packaged, and transformed by industry. Tea bags, iced tea, and the ways convenience reshapes flavor. We'll keep the tone gentle, though, because even modern tea has its quiet moments. A mug at a desk, a thermos on a train, a cold glass sweating in summer shade. For now, let the platform fade. Let the calls of chai drift into the distance like birds at dusk. Let the spice linger in your imagination. Ginger warmth in the throat, cardamom sweetness in the breath. And if you're listening at night in a quiet room, you can hold that warmth without the noise, letting it settle into you like a slow, steady glow. Modern tea begins with a small surrender, a surrender to speed. As the world accelerates, factories, offices, trains, timed shifts, scheduled lives, people still want tea, but they want it with less waiting. The leaf, patient by nature, is asked to behave like a button you press, and so tea is reshaped into convenience. Imagine a kitchen in the early 20th century. Not a temple, not a tea room, not a caravan camp. Just an ordinary home with an ordinary clock on the wall. Someone wants a cup quickly before leaving. They do not want to measure leaves, rinse a pot, watch timing like a hawk. They want the warmth and the familiar taste with minimal ceremony. This is where the tea bag enters the story. At first, it's almost accidental in the way many useful things are. Tea samples are sometimes sent in small fabric or paper packets, meant to be opened and poured out. Someone drops the whole packet into hot water instead. It works. The idea sticks. Soon the packet is designed to be dropped in on purpose, and tea becomes a thing you can make without touching the leaves at all. The change seems small, but it isn't. A tea bag favors certain kinds of tea, smaller particles, broken leaf, dust, and fannings, the bits that infuse quickly. Quick infusion means convenience, but it also means a different flavor profile, often stronger, sometimes harsher, less layered. It's a trade. You gain speed, you lose some nuance. Yet for millions of people, that trade is worth it. Because tea is not always about nuance. Sometimes it is about being held together. A tea bag can be the difference between having a cup and not having one. In a busy day, that matters. A simple mug becomes a portable pause. Now picture another modern transformation. Tea made cold. Iced tea becomes popular in places and moments where heat makes hot beverages feel heavy. In summer, when the air is thick and the sun lingers, a glass of cold tea, especially sweetened, feels like relief. It sweats on the outside, cold water beating on glass like tiny pearls. Ice clinks. The first sip cools the mouth, the throat, the mood. Sweet tea, in some regions, becomes almost its own category. Tea not as a subtle infusion, but as a sugary, brisk drink that belongs on porches and at picnics, served in tall glasses, refilled without ceremony. It becomes part of local identity, a taste of summer, a taste of home. Here again, tea adapts to the day people live. But the modern era does not stop at bags and ice. It goes further into packaging and branding. Tea becomes a product with a logo, a slogan, a promise. The leaf, once tied to seasons and hillsides, is now blended to taste the same every time. Consistency becomes a selling point. If you buy a box today and another next month, you want the same flavor. So companies blend leaves from different regions and harvests to smooth out variation. There's a comfort in that sameness, and there is also a quiet loss. Variation is the signature of nature. This year's rain, last month's heat, the timing of pluck. When tea becomes standardized, it becomes reliable, but less alive to its own origins. It becomes more like a song played from a record, steady, familiar, not dependent on weather. Then come bottled teas, tea sealed in plastic or glass, shelf-stable, sold cold, sometimes flavored with lemon or peach or jasmine, sometimes sweetened heavily, sometimes marketed as healthy or clean. Bottled tea is tea that has been turned into an industrial beverage. It travels without needing a kettle. It sits under bright convenience store lights. It belongs to commutes and vending machines. And in recent decades, tea becomes playful in another way: bubble tea. Imagine a cup filled with milk tea or fruit tea, with black pearls of tapioca gathered at the bottom like soft stones. You drink through a wide straw and feel the surprise of texture, chewy, bouncy, oddly comforting. Bubble tea makes tea into a snack, into a social accessory, into something shared with friends in bright cafes. It is far from monastery silence, yet it is still, in its own way, a comfort ritual. Tea never stops finding new costumes. But if you step back, the old heart of tea remains recognizable. Hot water meets leaf. Time passes. Flavor emerges. Even in the modern world, you can still choose to slow down. You can choose loose leaf. You can choose to listen for the moment the kettle becomes ready. You can choose to notice how different water changes taste, how hard water can dull a delicate green tea, how softer water can let aroma rise more easily. You can choose to steep for a little less time and find sweetness where you expected bitterness. And you can also, if you want, let convenience serve you without guilt. Because the point of tea is not purity. The point is what tea does for the human nervous system. It creates a pause that feels acceptable. It gives you something to hold. It gives you warmth, or coolness, or sweetness, or steadiness. Now, before we go toward the end of our long journey, it helps to understand one more thing: why teas taste so different from one another, even though they come from the same plant. Green tea, black tea, oolong, white tea. These are not different plants. They are different treatments, different ways of guiding leaf through air and heat and time. The leaf can become grassy and bright, or malty and dark, or floral and complex, depending on what you let happen to it. In the next part, we'll slow down and sit with the leaf itself, its transformations, its chemistry, the gentle practicalities of brewing, temperature, timing, and the quiet science behind why tea can make you feel both calm and awake. For now, let modern life soften at the edges. Imagine a mug in your hands, maybe a tea bag, maybe loose leaf, Maybe something scented with bergamot. Maybe something spiced. The details don't matter as much as the warmth and the pause. The world can be fast. Your cup does not have to be. Bring the story back to the leaf. After all the caravans and ships, the ledgers and railways, the tea bags and bottles, tea is still, in the end, a plant meeting water. Everything else is human architecture built around that simple encounter. And the leaf is wonderfully changeable. One plant, Camellia sinensis, can become many kinds of tea, not because it has many personalities, but because people learned to guide its transformation. Tea is like music played on the same instrument in different styles. The notes are possible, and the method chooses which ones you hear. The first distinction is this: what happens after plucking. Fresh tea leaves begin to change the moment they are picked. They breathe, they wilt, their enzymes wake up. If you do nothing, air begins to work on them, slowly darkening them. That darkening, often called oxidation in tea making, creates deeper, warmer flavors. So tea making becomes a question of control. How much do you let the leaf change before you stop it? Green tea is tea where oxidation is stopped quickly. The leaves are heated soon after picking, steamed or pan-fired, so they keep their green color and much of their fresh, vegetal character. When brewed well, green tea can taste like spring leaves, seaweed, sweetgrass, steamed greens, sometimes with a gentle nuttiness. It can also taste bitter if overheated or oversteeped, because tenderness can become sharp when pushed too far. White tea is often made with minimal processing. Young buds and leaves are withered and dried gently, letting subtle changes occur without heavy rolling or intense heat. White tea can feel soft, lightly floral, sometimes honeyed, often delicate in a way that asks you to pay attention. It doesn't demand, it suggests. Oolong lives in the middle. It is partially oxidized, sometimes just a little, sometimes quite a lot, then shaped and finished with heat. Oolong can taste like orchids, peaches, cream, toasted nuts, roasted sugar, or warm minerals, depending on style and origin. It is often the tea that surprises people the most, because it refuses to fit into a simple green versus black idea of flavor. Oolong is a corridor with many doors. Black tea, called red tea in some traditions because of the color of its liquor, undergoes fuller oxidation. Leaves are withered, rolled, oxidized until they deepen in color and aroma, then dried to lock that profile in place. Black tea can be malty, cocoa-like, fruity, brisk, smoky. It stands up to milk and sugar, which is one reason it became so central in British-style tea drinking. And then there are teas that carry time inside them. Some teas are aged or fermented in ways that create earthy, deep flavors, like walking into a cool cellar, like damp forest floor after rain, like old wood and dried fruit. These teas can feel grounding, almost meditative, because their flavors are not bright and sharp, but rounded and slow. If you want a peaceful thought, tea is a record of time in different forms. A green tea is time kept young, a black tea is time allowed to deepen, an aged tea is time stored. Now let's bring it to the practical calm of brewing, because this is where tea becomes personal. Water temperature matters, not as a rigid rule, but as a way of respecting the leaf. Delicate green and white teas often prefer cooler water than boiling. Boiling water can pull bitterness quickly, making the cup feel harsh. Slightly cooler water coaxes sweetness, aroma, softness. Black teas and many robust blends can handle hotter water, often benefiting from it. Oolongs vary. Some love hotter water to open their rolled leaves. Others prefer gentler heat. Steeping time matters in the same gentle way. Longer steeping extracts more flavor, more astringency, more tannins. Shorter steeping can keep the cup cleaner and sweeter. If a tea tastes bitter, a simple answer is often cooler water, less time, or fewer leaves. Tea doesn't punish you, it simply responds. And water itself, the kind of water, matters too. Very hard water can make tea taste flat or dull because minerals interact with compounds in the leaf. Softer water often allows aroma and clarity to come through. It's one of those quiet truths that feel almost magical until you realize it's simply chemistry. Speaking of chemistry, tea's gentle mental effect comes from the combination of caffeine and an amino acid often associated with tea, theanine. Caffeine lifts alertness. Theanine can soften the edges, creating a steadier kind of focus. That's why tea can feel different from coffee. Less like a sudden push, more like a gradual brightening. But even that is not the whole story. Tea is also ritual chemistry, the way a repeated act signals the nervous system to settle. The kettle, the cup, the steam, these are cues. Your body learns them. Your mind begins to associate them with permission to slow down. That is why tea can feel calming even when it contains caffeine. The body hears the ritual and relaxes into it. Now, if you're listening at night, let's keep everything gentle. Imagine making a cup in slow motion. You choose your tea without urgency, simply by mood. You warm the cup with hot water and pour it out. You breathe in the scent of dry leaves, faintly sweet, faintly grassy, faintly woody, depending. You pour water, not violently, but steadily. The leaves move and then become still. You wait, not staring at a clock, just listening. Then you pour, and the cup catches the liquid like a quiet bowl catching rain. The first sip is often not the best one. The first sip is the greeting. The second sip is where the flavor opens. The third is where your shoulders start to drop. By the fourth, you are no longer drinking tea. You are simply being warm. In the next part, we'll begin our closing arc, bringing the long history back to the small human moment again. We'll talk about tea as an evening companion, a daily anchor, a gentle inheritance from centuries of hands. We'll let the empires and ships fade and keep what's useful, the pause, the warmth, the soft continuation. For now, let the leaf remain a leaf, small, patient, willing to unfold. Night returns the story to its simplest shape. After all the centuries, all the roots and arguments and inventions, tea still ends the same way. A warm cup in someone's hands, a quiet breath in someone's chest, a moment made softer by steam. It's comforting to remember that history, for all its scale, is built out of small rooms. Somewhere a person is finishing a late shift and putting water on. Somewhere an older couple is sitting at a kitchen table, speaking in low voices, the cup between them like a shared lantern. Somewhere a student is reading under a weak lamp, grateful for a steady kind of wakefulness. Somewhere someone is sick, and tea is the first gentle thing they can manage. Somewhere, someone has nothing to say, but still wants company. So they make tea and invite silence to sit with them. Tea is not a solution to the world, but it is a way people have learned to survive the world without hardening completely. That might be the most human thing about it. For a long time, tea was a luxury. Then it became a habit. Then it became, in some places, a need. Yet even when it is cheap and ordinary, tea can still feel like a gift. Because the gift is not the leaf alone, it's the pause. And the pause is something every era needs. In ancient hills, the pause belonged to monks and poets. In trading ports, it belonged to merchants and sailors. In drawing rooms, it belonged to careful hands arranging porcelain. In factories and offices, it belonged to workers stealing a few minutes for themselves. On railway platforms, it belonged to anyone who could spare the price of a small cup. In modern life, it belongs to whoever can claim it, even if only for 3 minutes by a kettle. If you think about it, tea is almost a lesson in scale. The leaf is small, but it can carry an empire's weight. The cup is small, but it can carry a day's emotion. The pause is small, but it can change how a person moves through the next hour. Even the act of brewing is a kind of gentle instruction. Wait for water. Respect heat. Give time. Don't force. Taste and adjust. And if you've ever had a cup that turned out too bitter, you know the quiet mercy embedded in tea. You can try again. You can steep less. Cool the water. Use fewer leaves. Tea does not demand perfection. It asks for attention, and it forgives imperfect attention. Now, let's imagine a simple evening ritual, one that could belong to anyone in any century with small differences. You dim the lights. You clear one tiny space, just enough for a cup. You choose a tea that fits night, maybe something soft and floral, maybe something roasted and warm, maybe something spiced in a way that feels like comfort. You let the kettle heat. You do not scroll, not yet. You let the sound of water be your soundtrack. When you pour, you watch the color change. You watch steam rise. You inhale once, slowly, and let your shoulders remember that they are allowed to loosen. Maybe you drink it at a window. Maybe you drink it on a couch. Maybe you drink it sitting on the edge of a bed, toes on the floor, feeling the day finally step back. And while you drink, you can let the long story fade into a single thought. A leaf grew. Hands picked it. Heat changed it. Water woke it. Now it warms you. That's enough. You don't have to carry every shadow of history into your cup, but you also don't have to deny that those shadows existed. You can simply acknowledge that tea has passed through many hands, some careful, some cruel, some tired, some joyful, and that the cup you hold now is a small continuation of all of it. If you want a gentle way to hold the truth, hold it like steam, visible for a moment, then gone. Now, as we come toward the end of this journey, let's return to the beginning, to the sound of water and the feeling of time slowing. Listen for the smallest sounds again, the faint click of ceramic, the soft swallow of a sip, the quiet exhale afterward. Those sounds are old sounds. They would be recognizable in any century. They are the sounds of a human taking a moment for themselves. And if you're listening to this to fall asleep, let tea be more than a topic. Let it be a cue. A cue that says, the day is allowed to end. Your mind does not need to solve anything right now. Your body does not need to prove anything right now. You can be like a tea leaf in warm water, unfurling without effort, releasing what you were holding, becoming softer with time. In the darkness, the kettle is silent. The cup is empty, or nearly so. The warmth remains, not as heat, but as a memory in the hands. And that is where we can leave the story. Not with a grand conclusion, not with a final moral carved into stone, but with something gentler. The last sip, the last breath, the quiet continuation. Good night, sweet dreams. And if your mind wanders back to the hills, the caravans, the ships, the tea rooms, the platforms, let it wander the way steam wanders, upward, slowly, until it disappears into sleep.